Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be one of my most requested videos, and that is, if I can get hold of it, to share all the books on my Kindle. I have had a Kindle of some sort for the last 6 or 7 years, if not more. This is a fairly new purchase. James bought it for me, my husband James bought it for me for my birthday in 2020. He actually called it "Never Need to Buy a Real Book Again," which I think may have been a slight hint that I needed to stop bringing physical books into the house. Didn't quite work. But yeah, this, because I've had a Kindle for so long, there are over 40 pages of books and audiobooks on here, so I am not going to be able to go through all of those today. What I'm going to do instead is go through the unread books that I have on my Kindle, which still amounts to over 30 books, so it's not a small amount. In order for this video not to just go on and on and on, I'm going to give a very brief overview of what I know about the books. So if you've read any and you think that I will really enjoy them, or you think that there are any that I should prioritize, then do let me know in the comments. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. I'm going to go in the order of newest to oldest because that's the order that I started writing them down in, and so that's the way we're going to work through them. And I'm also not going to include any net galley proofs, primarily because I tend to read those quicker, but also because the list would just be far too long. Also, going back through the list, I'm fairly certain that most of these books were either free or part of the Amazon's first reads selection. There's a little bit of a theme as we go through, but let's kick off. So the first book is The Secrets We Kept by Lara Prescott. This is a Cold War spy thriller historical fiction about two typists who are given the task of smuggling Dr. Zhivago back into Russia after the publication of his book. And his book is causing waves and ripples and is essentially threatening to topple the Soviets from power. I actually started listening to this when it was a Reese Witherspoon's book club pick, fairly certain that's the right one. And yeah, I didn't get very far into it, and I always meant to go back to it at some point, and then I didn't. So when I spotted it, I think it was 99p on Kindle, I snapped it up because I'm very interested in going back and finishing it. Next we have The Love We Left Behind by Catherine Slee. This is a dual timeline story. We have a timeline set in 2012 and then a timeline set in the 90s, and it's the story of two friends, Neve and Erica, and something happens, I believe, in the 90s which drives the friends apart, and then in our more present day timeline, Erica is forced to confront whatever it was that went on. The writing for this is meant to be absolutely stunning. If you look at the reviews, it's meant to be beautiful. Next we have Evidence of the Affair by Taylor Jenkins Reid. If you know me, you'll know that I'm a huge Taylor Jenkins Reid fan. I want to have read everything that she has ever written because I just love her writing style. This is actually a short story, and it's about Carrie and David, and it's told through letter form, so Carrie and David writing to one another, and it is essentially about the repercussions of an affair because both Carrie and David's spouses are having an affair with each other. So Carrie and David are the affected spouses, and yeah, it's about the fallout and the aftermath and the repercussions of affairs. Next we have We Met by Camille Baker. This is contemporary fiction with a little bit of a magical realism twist. We have our main character Corinne, who finds herself at a bit of a crossroads in her life, and then a dating app mysteriously appears on her phone called Met, which gives her the opportunity to reconnect with 4 missed connections in her life. At the same time, she is embarking on a new relationship and she's wondering whether to pursue that. This is, I have heard, funny and quirky. There's obviously a little bit of romance, but I've also heard that it is quite poignant, so very intrigued. Then we have Song of the Forever Rains by E.J. Mello. This is the first in a series, so probably one I won't get to for a little while, but always good to have options. It's a dark romantic fantasy about a young woman who finds hope in the destruction of her powers. don't know anything else about it, haven't really seen anyone talk about it. It would be interesting to know if any of you have read it and what you thought. As I say, I'm not really in a place to start any new series, but always good to have one on the list. West with Giraffes by Linda Rutledge was a book that I purchased because I just think that it sounds so intriguing and good. It's about a gentleman who is 105 and he is reflecting on an event that happened when he was younger in the 1930s, in which two giraffes are travelling and they survive, I think it's a hurricane, when they're travelling across the Atlantic, and then they're taken cross country to the San Diego Zoo, and he is obviously part of the group that is travelling with them or ensuring that they are safe whilst they travel. It's based on a true story, so it sounds like it's going to be an interesting blend of fact and fiction. It just seems like nothing that I've ever read before. So often books that are set in the 1930s are World War fiction, and this just sounds totally different, completely fascinating. Yeah, just one that I had to have on my list to read at some point. Then we have a book which is probably extremely well known, and that is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is dark fantasy about a young woman who lives in a village which is situated at the edge of a forest, and there are lots of dark and tragic goings on in the forest, and the villagers are essentially protected by a wizard called the Dragon, and the payment that the dragon extracts for his protection is that every 10 years he takes a young girl from the village and she has to serve him, but she has to serve him completely. So she leaves her friends and her family and the whole life that she has known behind her. Our main character is worried that it's going to be her best friend because she meets all the criteria that is typical of the young girl that this wizard selects. But when it's actually our main character who is chosen, our story begins. As I say, this is a very popular book on BookTube. It was one that I thought, oh, I probably will want to read it at some point. I do have, I don't know if it's the sequel or like a companion novel or whether it's just totally unrelated, called Spinning Silver. I actually have the physical copy of that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know from anyone who does know whether I have to read Uprooted first or whether they're completely unrelated. Then we have After Alice Fell by Kim Taylor Blakemore. This is historical gothic romance, and it's the story of Marion, who is suspicious with the account that she is given after her sister mysteriously dies in the asylum where she is living. Marion believes that she may have been murdered. So when a mysterious stranger comes forward and says that they saw her sister fall, Marion essentially sets off on a course to find out exactly what has happened. This is meant to be quite dark. Obviously it'll be interesting to see how the romance element fits into it, but reading the synopsis, it definitely gives me Daphne du Maurier type vibes, and I think dark gothic stories are always really good for autumn and winter, so another one that I am excited to have. Next we have Confessions of a Curious Bookseller by Elizabeth Green. I have to admit that this gives me full on You've Got Mail vibes, in that we have a quirky bookstore owner bookseller and then a new bookstore opens just around the corner, although in the case of this book it's an indie bookseller rather than a mega book chain. The fact that the premise is so similar, and this is told through texts and emails and journal entries, definitely makes me feel like it's a modern twist on the classic film. And the reason that I downloaded it is because I love the movie, so I'm really hoping it is that kind of modern facelift rather than a complete rip-off, but yeah, we will see. Next we have Spellbreaker by Charlie N. Holmberg. This is YA fantasy about two characters, Elsie and Bacchus. Elsie is an unlicensed spellbreaker, which is considered a crime in the world where she lives, and so when she's caught by Bacchus using her magic, she strikes a bargain with him to try and keep her secret hidden. Then the two of them find themselves caught up in a murder mystery, and everything that they think they know is essentially turned upside down on its head. The premise of this sounds really interesting, but when you look at the reviews, they are incredibly mixed. It's either like a 4-star, 5-star read or a 1-star read, so I'm not really sure what I'm going to think about it. It might be that the premise is really good but it's just poorly executed, which would obviously be disappointing, but yeah, I would definitely be interested to hear from anyone who's read it and what you thought. I'm pretty certain that this next book was an Amazon First Reads choice because it's not the type of book that I would typically go for. It's this Magnificent Dumbo by David Biro, and it's about a young boy in Italy who is diagnosed with leukemia and a disenchanted rabbi in New York who transpires to be the perfect match for a bone marrow transplant for our young boy Luca. And in seeking the treatment for Luca's nurse essentially uncovers some hidden Second World War family secrets which I think somehow tie our rabbi and our young boy together. So it's very much a look at family and identity and belonging, and what is particularly interesting about this book, and I think will be what made me choose it because it's what kind of piqued my interest when I was reading up about it, the author themselves has suffered with leukemia, and so I think it's going to be quite an interesting and accurate look at the repercussions of that within a family dynamic as well. So yeah, pretty sure that's why I added it to the list. It's one that I'm sure I will get to at some point. Then we have Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane. This is described as a gripping, emotional and life-affirming bestseller, which is lofty praise indeed. It is about two families who live next door to each other in New York, and growing up their children are inseparable, and then a tragedy blows everything apart, and I'm pretty certain it's the aftermath of that and these two families coming to terms with whatever it is that has gone on. Again, this is a book that I've seen fairly regularly in the book community, so if you've read it and you would recommend it, do let me know. Then we have The Other Girl by C.D. Major. This is about a woman who has been living in an asylum in New Zealand since she was 5 years old. It's set in the 1940s, and a devastating fire rips through the asylum 15 years after this young woman was sent there, and on investigation, on questioning, the police begin to wonder whether she should ever have been in the asylum in the first place, and so they draw a young doctor into the mix. And essentially I think not all is as it seems. It's a historical mystery thriller, and it actually sounds really good, but reading the synopsis definitely gave me slightly creepy vibes, like why is this girl in the asylum? Why do they suspect that she might not need to be? Did she have something to do with the fire? So many questions. Don't know what's going to happen. Unfortunately, my camera battery died in the middle of me talking about a book, so if I've slightly shifted position, then that's why. I'm just going to start again, and hopefully the transition will be completely seamless and you won't even know if I hadn't said anything. So the next book on the list is The Rabbit Girls by Anna Ellery. This is historical fiction. There is a lot of historical fiction on this list, I'm realising as I'm sitting and talking about it. So this is set in the 1980s. We're following main character Miriam, who is caring for her dying father against the backdrop of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and while she's going through her father's things, Miriam comes across a letter from a female prisoner who was in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Don't know if I've said that right, I hope I have. And then she also discovers a tattoo, an Auschwitz tattoo on her father's arm, and this, as you might imagine, opens up a whole can of worms for Miriam about who her parents really were. As she begins to look into their pasts, she discovers the story of the Rabbit Girls, essentially young women who were experimented on in the concentration camps. So it sounds like it's going to be a pretty horrific and haunting read. I think I've said before that I'm always a fan of reading previously unknown to me World War stories, and this is based on fact, so I think that it will also be quite an interesting and eye-opening read as well. Then we have Scarlet Odyssey, which is a science fiction fantasy mystery book with an African inspired setting. Again, this was an Amazon First Reads selection, but in the reviews it is compared to Game of Thrones, so I am extremely excited to get to it. The reason that I haven't yet is because it's the first in a series. I think I've already said in this video, I'm trying very hard not to start any new series at the moment, but it sounds right up my street. It just sounds so good. It's meant to be dark, a little bit violent, and I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan, so yeah, very intrigued by this. The basic premise is that we have Sarlo, who is obsessed with books and magic, despite the fact that it is very much looked down upon for men in his tribe to use magic. And when his village is attacked by an enchantress, Sarlo is charged by the queen to go on a quest to basically uncover some information that could help to save the destruction of his people. Honestly, just sounds so good. I can't wait to read it. I just really need to finish some of the series that I'm currently reading, but there's just so many good books out there to read. So many books and so little time. Then we have The Beekeepers Promise by Fiona Valpy. This was actually on my summer TBR, but I just didn't get around to reading it. It's a dual timeline story, surprise surprise, which is centered around the Chateau Bellevue in France. We have our more present day timeline with Abby, who has gone there to escape her heartbreak. And then we have our historical timeline with Eliane, who is experiencing her own heartbreak as the threat of the Second World War looms. Definitely one that I'll get to. I mean, there is a huge theme with these books. Most of them are dual timeline and or historical fiction. There's a theme. I clearly have a particular interest in these stories, so yeah, definitely one that I will get to soon. Then we have The Queen's Poisoner by Jeff Wheeler, again the first in a series. Very interested to read it, but just don't want to commit to any new series. I know I sound like a broken record, but it's just one to have on my Kindle in reserve. So this is about a young boy called Owen who is sent to the court of a usurper king, and whilst he is there he has to learn to navigate the politics, navigate court life, learn to trust the elusive and mysterious Queen's Poisoner. And I'm pretty sure we follow Owen as he grows up. So when we start he's about 5, and then when we finish he is a young man. So first in a series, again, very well received, lots of high praise in its reviews. One that I really want to read but just can't commit to at this moment in time. Here we have A Girl from Nowhere by James Maxwell, which again is the first in a series, although this time it's science fiction rather than fantasy. So I'm just going to really quickly read you the blurb. Surrounded by fire, a girl with mysterious powers and a young warrior search for safety. Life in the wasteland is a constant struggle. No one knows it better than Taimin. Crippled and with only his indomitable aunt to protect him, Taimin must learn to survive in a world scorched by 2 suns and frequented by raiders. But when Taimin discovers his homestead ransacked and his aunt killed, he sets off with one mission: to seek revenge against those who stole everything. With nowhere to call home, his hunt soon takes a turn when he meets a mystic, Selena, who convinces him to join her search for the fabled White City. Taimin and Selena both need refuge, and the White City is a place where Taimin may find someone to heal his childhood injury. As they avoid relentless danger, Taimin and Selena attempt to reach the one place that promises salvation, and they can only hope that the city is the haven they need it to be. Again, I read it and I get really excited, but I just cannot commit to any more series. I'm not quite sure what is coming next, but Lord, I hope it's not me saying the same things again. It's not the first in a series. Next up we have In an Instant by Suzanne Redfern. This is contemporary fiction with quite an interesting premise in that we are reading from the perspective of a dead narrator. So it gives me very similar vibes to The Lovely Bones in that respect. We have a 16-year-old girl who is on a trip with her family when they sadly are involved in a crash and they fall over a cliffside, and our 16-year-old narrator is killed, and she finds herself caught in between 2 worlds. So she is basically watching the aftermath of the situation and how the survivors struggle to come to terms with what has happened. It does sound like it will be quite a difficult read. I wasn't a huge fan of The Lovely Bones, and I would question whether the narrator would be a little bit unreliable or biased, which is not something that I hugely enjoy, but it intrigued me enough that I wanted to add it to my Kindle list, so yeah, we will see. Next we have The Names of the Dead by Kevin Wignall. This is a spy thriller about an ex-CIA agent who has been in prison in France after an anti-terrorist mission goes wrong. He finds himself abandoned by agency, by his colleagues, by his friends and family, basically everyone. And then he discovers that his ex-wife has been killed in a terrorist attack in Spain, and he is given early release. And then he discovers that his son is missing, but the plot twist is that he didn't even know he had a son. And so our protagonist, Wes, sets off on a journey across Europe to basically find out what is going on. He has his suspicions about this terrorist attack. He obviously wants to find his son, but his past is threatening to catch up with him. And so our story unfolds. Honestly, just sounds like a high-octane spy thriller book that I will be very pleased to read at some point. The only non-fiction that I have on this list is Anne Boleyn, 500 Years of Lies by Hayley Nolan. I think the content of this is fairly self-explanatory. Anne Boleyn is often painted as a villainous individual from British history. You know, she's the dark seductress who stole Henry VIII from his first wife and caused this huge fracture between Parliament and church and all those kind of things, and Hayley Nolan is essentially looking at why that is not actually historically accurate and why that is not the case, and who Anne Boleyn really was. I have read a lot of historical fiction, well, I've read a lot of historical fiction full stop, but I've read a lot of historical fiction centred around Henry VIII, centred around the Tudors and Henry VIII's wives. Anne Boleyn in particular, she does make for a good villainous character, but it would be interesting to see how much of that is actually rooted in fact and how much is creative license on the part of the authors. So yeah, very interested to get to this one as well. Then we have The Vine Witch by Luann G. Smith. This is about a witch who has been under a curse and living as a toad for the last 7 years, and then she is freed and basically sets about seeking revenge on those who did wrong to her. This has a very fairy tale-esque type vibe. When I was reading the premise, I thought it sounded really interesting. Again, it's one that has very mixed reviews. Some people either really rate it, or some people just really disliked it. So no idea where I will sit on that particular spectrum. But yeah, just it sounds very quaint, it sounds quite interesting. I think our main character has to sort of learn to re-navigate her life, which has obviously moved on from how it was when she became a toad. What a random thing to say. You know, her home is overgrown, it's been taken over by someone, that kind of thing, and the person that she loved is no longer in love with her, etc, etc. Yeah, I think there are layers to this story that it will be interesting to unpack. Then we have Quantum by Patricia Cornwell. This is a spy mystery thriller set against the backdrop of NASA. So we have our main character, Captain Callie, who on the eve of a top secret space mission discovers a crime scene in the basement at NASA, and the clues all seem to point to the involvement of Callie's twin sister, who has been MIA for a number of days. But Callie doesn't believe that her sister would have been involved, and so she sets out trying to clear her name, only to discover that the stakes are much higher than she first thought. This is, I mean, if you can't tell from some of the books in this list, I do like a good spy mystery thriller type book. This is more interesting to me because it sounds like your typical detective mystery story, but I like that it has the NASA space setting, because that's not like anything that I have read before. So very interested to see what I think about this. Then we have The Watchmaker's Daughter by CJ Archer. This is a book that I actually started to read one time when I'd gone to soft play. I can remember exactly where I was actually. I'd gone to soft play and I hadn't got the book that I was actually reading, and so I downloaded this one. Always intended to go back to it, although didn't find that it gripped me hugely, but it is a historical fiction with a fantasy twist. We have a young woman called India who is a watchmaker by trade, and she has worked alongside her father for many years. Sadly, her father is recently deceased and India has been dumped by her fiance, and so she finds herself essentially stranded because nobody wants to employ her. She's a little bit disgraced, I think, with the leaving of her fiance, and then a mysterious stranger turns up on her doorstep and offers her employment, and she suspects that there is something not quite right going on, but she's kind of caught between needing the money from the employment and wondering whether she should report what she is uncovering. Essentially, there's a little bit of a fantastical element. I think some of the watches maybe do something a bit clever. I think one of them like regenerates someone, from what I can remember, something like that. It's not just your straightforward historical fiction set in the Victorian period. There is something else going on. As I say, I did intend to go back to it, but it obviously didn't grip me fully because we're probably talking 5 or 6 years ago that I started reading it. So do intend to go back. Again, I think this might be the first one in a series. Do correct me if I'm wrong. Do let me know if it's worth me just getting rid of it, or and considering it a DNF, or whether it is worth going back and having another go. Actually making myself laugh with some of these books because there is very definite pockets of themes from them. So the next one is The Postcard by Leah Fleming. Classic dual timeline setup. We have our 1930s timeline with Caroline, who has grown up on a remote farm in Scotland with her aunt Phoebe, and when she discovers that Phoebe is actually her mother, Caroline flees to Egypt in rebellion, and there she finds herself in an unhappy marriage. She has an affair and then she falls pregnant. So her personal life is essentially in tatters, and when she is given the opportunity to, I think, carve her own path, she agrees to smuggle secrets from the British government into Europe. When she returns at the end of the war, which will be the Second World War, she finds that her baby has gone. Then we have our more modern day timeline, which is set in Australia, and we have a young woman who finds some letters among her recently deceased father's belongings, which sets her off on her path to discover who she really is. Totally classic dual timeline setup, but you know, a girl likes what a girl likes. Another novella, we have Gilded Ashes by Rosamund Hodge. I'm pretty certain that I downloaded this one because it sits alongside the Cruel Beauty series by Rosamund Hodge, and I wanted to test whether I liked the writing style, whether I would be interested in the story before I committed to buying the books. Never actually then got around to reading it. These books are a dark reimagining of Cinderella, and yeah, when I first joined BookTube, they were everywhere, and I was very interested in knowing what they were about, and just then never got round to reading the novella, never got round to buying any of the other books. Probably will at some point, I guess. I was obviously going through a thing because the next book is The Bookshop on the Corner by Rebecca Raisin, and again this is a companion novella to Rebecca Raisin's Gingerbread series, which I have not read and do not own and probably have never ever seen, so can't really talk too much about this either. I think you do actually have to have read the Gingerbread trilogy in order to read this novella. So we have a old-fashioned romantic bookseller and a slick New York journalist whose lives come together. But as I say, I think you have to have read the other books for these particular characters and their stories to make sense. So I don't know if I'll ever read this one because I don't know if I'll ever read those ones. So there you go. We are down to our last two. Thank you so much if you have managed to stay with me. The next one we have is A Walk Across the Sun by Corbin Addison. This is contemporary about two sisters who are sold into slavery when their home is destroyed, and their home is on India's Coromandel coast, and it's destroyed by a tsunami, and as they try to flee to safety they are betrayed and sold. And then we have a Washington lawyer called Thomas who is struggling after the death of his baby daughter and the subsequent collapse of his marriage, and he takes a sabbatical from his job and accepts a position in the Bombay branch of an international anti-trafficking group. And through that, Thomas finds himself on a path not only to try to save his marriage, but also to try to save these two sisters. Honestly, forgot that I even had this book, and on reading the synopsis I just think it sounds so good. Definitely going to make this particular one a priority because it sounds great. And the final book that I have is The Sea Change by Joanne Rossiter. This is a contemporary about an estranged mother and daughter and the way that their two lives collide once again. So we have Alice, the daughter, who is in India following her honeymoon, and she wakes up to see a large, huge tsunami wave coming towards the island and her new husband nowhere in sight. And then the mother, who is struggling with reconciling what happened in her past when she was forced to leave her home when it was requisitioned during the war, and as a result of the war she also lost the love of her life, and then presumably she loses her daughter and sets off on a journey to find her. So it's about the mother and the daughter and their relationship and how they come back together, I believe. And that is it. They're all the books on my Kindle that are currently on Read. I actually really enjoyed this exercise as a way of reminding myself what is on my Kindle. It's very easy to ignore those books when I'm faced with a physical stack of books, but there are a number that I have talked about today that I'm definitely going to prioritise. And as I said at the beginning, if you've read any and you think, Jess, you would love that book, then do let me know. But yeah, thank you very much to the people who repeatedly asked me to do this video, because it has been extremely beneficial, I think. So if you made it to the end of the video, thank you very much. I hope that you are all keeping safe and well. Take care, and I will see you all soon.